I love dogs.
I love dogs too.
Glad we're all on the same page.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Sarah Andreyko Show.
We're having a sunny day here finally. It's been ice and snow, oddly, in North Carolina. So, which you're probably more used to that kind of weather than I am.
I am. Get my station. I use a little, ergo placemat, and it's good for my feet, but it also keeps me stationed in camera.
Yeah, so you don't move around as much.
Totally. I'm like, and then like, oh, wait a minute. That's right. I gotta focus here.
I do the same thing. And anytime I'm giving like a presentation or a speech, one of the bigger complaints I get is like, you're all walking all over. I'm like, that's how my brain moves. It's very hard to stay stationary and continue my thought processes. But
exactly. I know when I'm doing these recordings without video, for me, it's often a matter of putting on the Bluetooth, and then it's pacing laps throughout the office and just kind of where are we at? What are we doing? How does this work?
Exactly.
Sure.
I feel like it's so much easier. I don't know if it's like just sitting still. You get kind of, it's like, okay, we got to move the blood. We got to get things circulating. But I'm getting used to it. It's getting better because you can't pace when you're doing podcasts. It just doesn't work if it's video anyway.
No, for me, the difference, still being able to do them standing makes a big difference. So I'm in the process of reconfiguring the office. Or right now, I literally only have a standing desk. I don't actually have anywhere to sit in my office, which is helpful and problematic depending on what I'm working on. So I've got some new equipment on the way, and once that all arrives, and anyways.
Yeah, and what's under your feet, making sure you're taking care of that back and everything with standing.
Yeah.
So by the way, I love that photo in the back of in your room there. I have that picture as well.
That one?
Mm-hmm. It is like my constant reminder of my first like dog that I fell in love with as a child growing up. She was a Chesapeake Bay Retriever, and so that always reminded me of her. I love that one.
It always cracks me up too, because that although the dog looks very different, that was very much sort of the image. As you came into our master bedroom in the house we lived in White Bear Lake when we were in Minnesota, and our Great Dane would always curl up, and you would never know that she was 130 pounds because she was this tight little ball, and then she would stand up into this ginormous leggy beast, and you're like, holy crap, where'd that come from? So it's a good reminder of her as well.
Aww, yeah. The bittersweetness to it.
Right. There's something to be said for the giant breeds. Although, I mean, she lived to be almost 12. She was about 11 years, 8-9 months. Yeah, exactly. People talk about losing the Danes and the Mastiffs at like
7,
6,
8, 9. Yeah,
and
easy.
7. Yeah, like double digits, unheard of. And yeah, she was just about to hit 12. We lost her to a bone cancer.
Oh my gosh.
Again, at age 12, it's like you know it's going to be something, and the hope was really we'd be able to identify what it was far enough in advance that she wouldn't experience significant pain or discomfort as a result of it.
Excellent.
And it was something that the massage therapist we were using at the time actually identified the lesion first. She was like, "Hey, she's got a little bump on her leg," and we're like, "Yeah, that's always been there." She's like, "Yeah, no." There's something different, and we literally just like put a hand on and went,
Oh, yeah.
So, but having a great team around was what allowed us to catch it, and then have that time to create an action plan to say, hey, if this, then this, as long as this, then this, and to be able to do that. So it was an important part of her process as well.
That plan ahead of time is so important, because when you're, lost in that emotional state and you're farther in the process and you don't have that plan to stick to, it's so easy to, make decisions that might not necessarily be what you would have in a clear-headed state.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, for her, that it was the difference of knowing that it was a front leg, and she actually was pretty sound orthopedically, but was old enough and big enough and just ataxic enough in the hind end that we knew if she started having to weight shift back or started to show any sort of right-left favoritism, that was going to be a very steep, slippery slope that was going to kick very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So established that criteria, and the first time she went out, actually Robert and I were both there at the time, and she had gone out to use the backyard to potty, and she went to squat to pee, and raised that front right just a little bit, and both of us just looked at each other and went, "Ah, shit."
Yep.
Okay, let's watch her. Let's give her a day or two. Make sure, we're not going to rush the process, but also we're not going to prolong it either. And she's just a little bit more pronounced, and we were like, okay.
Yep.
So, anyways, I could go down that rabbit hole, but...
Oh my gosh, I know. Me too. Well, and I got so excited. There's a, I didn't know she was here. She didn't know I was here. It's like one of those people that you've been around for 20 years, but you have no idea that either of you exist in the same city. There's a senior dog doctor here in Charlotte. And I feel like that's such a niche that needs more filling, because primary care vets, it's kind of like the same old thing when it comes to managing senior inflammation and pain and joints and everything else. And I was so excited to find that she was in this area and connected with her recently. But her dedicated path is all to senior dogs and comfort and helping people through all of the crazy stuff that comes with having a senior dog and knowing what to do about those things. And yeah, so super excited to find her here, but yeah, kind of.
That is amazing. Well, and it reminds me as you say that too. I in my head as I was logging in this morning, I was like, wait a minute, where is Sarah? Like, where in the U.S.? I lose all context when we meet everybody through Zoom, and so I'm glad you mentioned Charlotte. I don't know if I'll be able to make it this year, but the Fetch DVM 360 conference in April, I believe, is live in Charlotte.
Mm-hmm. Fetch DVM 360.
Yeah, it's Fetch. Fetch is kind of the branded conference name, but yeah, there's a possibility. I think I'm listed as a speaker on the docket right now, with the caveat that I'm actually supposed to be testifying in front of a jury in Hawaii on a feline legal case that I'm an expert witness on, and so. Legal cases, like 9 times out of 10, they end up rescheduling, postponing, settling 2 weeks prior. So they're like, we're going to throw you on the docket as an option. Here are the lectures you will be giving if you can make it. So it's going to be a last minute. Either I'll be in Hawaii testifying legally, or I'll be in Charlotte. So if we're there, if I'm there, then it would be fun to
I'd love to connect.
If it worked out.
Absolutely, and grab some dinner and have some awesome conversation. But hey, if you end up in Hawaii, I mean, that's not a bad place to testify. Just saying.
I know. I was like, oh, Oahu. Okay.
Oh, gee, it's really gonna put me out, but
Right. Like, yeah, and it's for I don't know exactly where it is, but we'd be in Oahu. There's a court case involving one of the beachfront resorts and a cat and a patron who was bitten and anyways, but yes, and almost all of the legal cases that I get involved with they're a bite case typically relative to insurance coverage. Kind of who should have known, who was responsible. Is it was it the owner, meaning homeowners? Was it the business owner? Was it the individual? So they're usually, I mean, they're cases that range anywhere from like $400,000-$500,000 settlements to multi-million-dollar settlements in cases of disfiguring injuries relative to bites. And so it's a lot. I'm grateful to have the experience under my belt to be able to stand up under pressure in front of juries. It's not for the faint of heart.
No, that's really cool. I did my first court appearance as an expert witness a few weeks ago, I want to say. But anything I've ever done has always been kind of, oh, we'd like your opinion. Oh, can you come assess this dog? But not, oh, we need a full legal write-up and we need you to testify. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. So I actually called Jim Crosby down in Florida and I was like, can you review all my notes and make sure I don't do anything stupid? And he's like, yeah, sure, no problem. So he gave me a little coaching session, and I've been, with other things, animal related in and out of the court systems just for various different things. So I had a little bit of experience, at least as to what it was going to be like, the whole attorney, even though there are no sides, as a witness, you're not on a side, but there's always that chance that some attorney is going to try to rip you apart. And I know I shouldn't say this, but I actually had a lot of fun schooling the attorney in this last case because he had no idea what he was talking about. And I was like, well, actually. But it was.
That's usually the case. It's one of the things that we kind of use as the secret weapon to be able to talk whoever has hired me. Again, I agree. Yeah. It's not about sides. No. It's not about plaintiff, defendant. It's about sort of what does science represent for this, what can we say definitively? And yeah, I remember there was one of the cases where, the litigator, the prosecutor was fuming. I mean, color changed. There was spittle flying. This was pre-masks. Like, so he was
dramatic.
livid. Oh, it was, I mean, and it was, the dog has been labeled by its veterinarian as aggressive. And like, it was these dramatic pauses. And every time aggressive came out, I was like, okay, well, let's define that.
Yeah, I love that.
You know,
yeah, exactly. What does that mean?
We're going to need to actually, right. So under which context and this and that, and he's like, yeah, but the veterinarian said, I'm like, yes. You know, so again, it was that whole process. And like this entire huge, it was a disfiguring facial bite that was involved. And because the dog had shown sort of mild defensiveness in the veterinary clinic, it was sort of like, that's our slam dunk.
Yeah.
That's going to win us the case. And I was like, actually, that's not nearly as powerful as someone might have led you to think. So
let's dissect this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could just see the whole, like,
I
the
know.
whole case kind of unraveled around him at that point. So it was good times.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah, that'd be interesting. How long have you been doing cases?
You know, I think the first one was probably back in, I think that case was my first one, actually. It was literally trial by fire. And that one I think was probably 2014, 2015.
Yeah. Good. So you got some under your
so,
belt then. Yeah, you got some good experience.
Yeah, no, I've been retained, I think, 30 or 40 times at this point, and have done probably a dozen or so depositions, you know, in a recording context or in person, back when we did that routinely. And then, yeah, about a half dozen, maybe 6, 7, 8, in front of jury cases. And, you know, enough to know what they typically go like, but also enough to know that there are so many ins and outs of the legal system that I've actually been burned a couple of times, even with a fair amount of experience, where I've come in expecting it to be one thing and not knowing exactly what question to ask. Mm-hmm. And then finding out we're halfway through a deposition and we're like, oh, this is not sort of the, like the deposition I just did, I had already written an expert witness statement. So they were basically trying to poke holes in the opinions I had already created.
Right.
Versus, I think it's called a discovery deposition. If you haven't prepared a formal statement, but they are expecting you to go line by line with the individual opinions that you have. And all of the ones that I had done in the past were always more sort of Q&A based. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this? What's your opinion on this? So I've learned sort of kind of, you're kind of a bit coy with your answers.
Yeah.
You know, answer only the question that was asked, allow them to tease it out. So I came into it coming at that angle.
That is so hard to do.
And that guy was so pissed. He was like waiting for me to give my opinions. And he's like, do you have opinions? I'm like, yes.
Of course I do.
And he's like, what are they? Like, well, I'm prepared. He's like, and at some point I was like, oh, shit. This is not that. This is this deposition, not that one. Right. And then I was able to switch gears, thank God, quickly enough to make a difference. But I was like, when I told the legal counsel later, I was like, hey, FYI, that was not the deposition description that you gave me. Yeah, and it was like a multi-pit bull disfiguring guy, almost died, sort of like, it was a big deal. I was like, ooh, I was grateful I was wearing a shirt that didn't show sweat through, because I was drenched by the time I came out of that. And it was a video deposition too, so it was like all of the awkwardness of trying to...
You learn from every experience. You grow from every experience, pleasant or not. Right.
Kudos for joining the world of expert witness stuff. It's I often when people are like, how does that go? I was like, well, it pays well, and it's an effing pain in my ass.
Yeah. I found it interesting. Like I said, I've only ever been on like the backside, not like frontal. Like, hey, Sarah, what do you think about this? Or have you met this dog? Or can you what do you think a potential outcome could be? Right, exactly. Not, oh, we need very specific objective information and you're going to testify. Oh, and by the way, you need to be available on call. And it's like, oh, okay. Right? Yeah, great.
Right? Mm-hmm. That's the thing, like with this Hawaii case, I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll clear my schedule. So I actually, and you may have this already, but one of the things that I ended up building in after the first couple of cases is that my retainer document now has a clause that if you've asked me to hold specific days, weeks, or hours, and if you give me insufficient ability to rebook those with other events, if those timelines end up being vacant, I will bill you at my normal rates for having reserved those times.
Good, yeah.
So again, I had a couple times where like, oh, actually, no, that all got rescheduled, and we're gonna need you to juggle. I was like, you know what? No,
I'm gonna need you to pay the bill, and then we can discuss where we're going after that. Yeah,
completely.
Exactly.
Oh, and some of them drag on. Like one that just settled, like this legal case, this Hawaii one. I think the incident was in 2016, maybe. They drag on forever, and then with COVID, postponements and this and that. So
well, and this is just a side topic, and we don't have to get on a tangent, but something that bothers me rather considerably is that the way that the laws are set up here, at least in the Southeast, these court case dogs are here for 2, 3, 4 years, and they are going nuts. Like, it's so interesting that we have these animal welfare laws that we implement on the public, but then you have shelters that are trying to do the right thing that are basically, committing animal cruelty themselves because they have no other choice, because the law says you have to hold them. You can't release them to foster. You can't release them wherever. I mean, only the national companies I've found, when I've worked with ASPCA or HSUS, they will very quietly, legally transfer them into foster at least, but the shelters can't. And I'm like, I got to get involved from a legislative perspective at some point on this. Like, I need to add something else to the plate. But I mean, one of the shelters I'm working with down here in South Carolina in particular, it's horrible. Every time I go visit this one dog, he's just spinning. He's been there for 4 years. He's just spinning in his kennel the whole entire time. And even the little amount of enrichment, the little amount of interruption that you can do for him really doesn't, in the long run, do anything. It's horrible. No. Anyway, yeah.
No, it's a drop in the bucket, and almost in some ways this truly is a rabbit hole we could go down. But I've worked in shelters with very similar experiences there too, and it's the inability, whether it's because of a safety issue or whether it's because of ownership, the inability to prescribe meds, the compromise that often happens in terms of medical care, and just so many layers that I agree. There's a reason why the animal may be there in the first place, but are we doing the best by them by handling it in that particular way? Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Yeah. For sure. But yeah, and I think part of it is just how long these court cases take too, how many appeals there are and everything else. But
yeah, exactly.
So on to our topic for the day. I feel like I could talk to you all day long about all these topics, which is so much fun. Thanks a lot for agreeing to come in and talk about supplements. I'm really, really excited about tackling supplements because this is like one of those huge booming markets out there for consumers, pet parents as consumers. That don't know about behavior modification, that don't know that they have access to board-certified veterinary behaviorists, or maybe are nervous about putting their animals on medication, even if it is suggested. So, companies have found this niche and filled it, and now there's all of these supplements out there that are unregulated. And, sometimes they can be really helpful, and sometimes they can be harmful. And so I really wanted to bring you on here, get your opinion about some of this stuff, see what you use, see what you don't, and maybe also just provide some guidance in particular to veterinarians out there and veterinary staff, because they're going to have to know some of this stuff. Their clients are going to come in and say, my dog has separation anxiety, so I started giving it melatonin, or these calming chews that have melatonin and CBD and lavender and, valerian root and all these other different things. And the vet's going to be like, okay, where do I even start? So I'm hoping we can dissect some stuff here, pull some pieces out, maybe talk about some things that people can look for, or just some guidance in.
I was just jotting down a couple of thoughts as you were I was like, okay, I answered in my head, at least sort of answered the questions and the product related things, but then, sort of the indications and when and how and why. And then on the owner side, what I hadn't jotted a note down was, do you have a timeline of efficacy? Or even a suspicion of when it might make a difference, if it will, versus, the clients who come in like, I've been giving it for 4 months, still waiting to see if it's going to work. I'm like, oh my God, you've spent like $700 on stuff that, no, if it didn't work in 4 days, it wasn't gonna. Mm-hmm. Or whatever the case may be, or whether it's within medications or supplements where clients have, basically we're asking them, did it work? And they're like, I don't know, what should I have looked for? You're like, oh no, like nobody gave you, or you didn't look for the opportunity to even understand what you're monitoring to evaluate efficacy. So now maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. We've lost all of that possibility of data. So we can dive into all of those things too in terms of how we guide or how owners and caregivers and pet parents really sort of make those decision pieces. So happy to do it.
I think I'd like to start from the regulation perspective, right? So if we're looking at foods, if we're regulating nutrition based on FDA standards, and whereas supplementation, medication also has a much more stringent of regulations, whereas supplements are not regulated by the FDA. In fact, there are several products that are out there that don't even list all of the ingredients on the packaging because it's not regulated. And we have these independent, and I wish there were more of them, frankly, but these independent companies that will test these products and actually go through them. And this is bigger in human supplementation than it is in animal, but they'll say, oh, this has, so many milligrams of X, Y, or Z. When we extract it and we look at it, there's hardly a trace of it in there. So I think we could start with kind of the regulation concern to begin with some of these products. And how do veterinarians know what to trust and what not to, or what's even worth the time versus what's not, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that the biggest question that I have as a prescriber or someone who's answering those questions for my client who comes in and says, hey, doc, what do you think? I look at it from the standpoint of saying, what's in it? Even just looking at the label. So is it something that I can get an inkling of whether this may or may not be effective for that? But then we've really got to have that sort of curiosity and maybe a little nod of skepticism to say, are we confident that what is on the label is in there? And that's only what's in there, and that we're not getting other trace elements or other things that could actually be problematic. Or do we have confidence that this is a company that is, actually putting the animal's needs and overall health status at the front of their formulations? Or are they trying to make something that's more palatable, and so the owner sees that the animal really, quote unquote, loves their supplement, but we're not actually getting the efficacy that we're looking for? So all of those considerations come to mind for me, and trying to get a sense of what's going on within those products. And, I remember having a conversation with a client one time. They said, well, but wait a minute, it's available on the market. So doesn't that mean automatically that there's been a certain amount of testing and a certain amount of awareness from the medical side? And I was like, well, I love your optimism. I love your enthusiasm for that piece. And the honest answer when it comes to supplements is no. In fact, even when we look at other industries as well, conversation had come up, not to get off topic, but a client was saying, well, but wait a minute, I've got this litter box for the cat, and wouldn't this be perfect? I was like, yeah, that is a perfectly designed litter box for a human caregiver. That is a terrible, terrible idea if someone were to actually ask the cat. And so I think about our supplement conversation in kind of the same way, that if we're looking at purchasing decisions and buying decisions and what gets regulated and what doesn't, and what do you put on the label and what do you leave off, that is arguably mostly for the human consumer and is in many cases really not tailored to the individual needs or the actual health status of the animal itself.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a big problem because we are very much us forward, us focused. So everything from the packaging to the way it smells when you open it up. Like I even think about things like your heavily fragranced dog shampoos that, completely throw the pH off, and now you end up with all sorts of skin issues because you just used something that smelled really lovely, right? Yes. So yeah, to your point, are we looking at this from the perspective of the animal that has a particular need, and are we actually doing good by trying to fill that need from the perspective of someone that doesn't have that education behind them? And so yeah, I think it's highly important, just given how nuts this industry is all of a sudden, for vets to be able to say, okay, let's look at what you've done, let's look at what you've researched yourself, because I think ownership with pet parents is so important. They want to feel a part of that process and feel like they've had some contribution to the solution for their own pet that they should know better than anybody else. So, okay, thank you for finding this and doing some research on this. Now let's take a look at some of these ingredients. Let's take a look at the problems that your pet is facing and decide, if something might be advantageous or if it might do absolutely nothing, or, and some of that might be gauging how the owner feels about it. I really want to try this. I really want to do this. Or I don't know what else to do, so I just pick this. How are we looking at it in terms of how the owner is feeling from an emotional state about what they're trying to do for their own animal?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, when you talk about sort of the ownership of kind of the role within decisions, it also reminds me that especially over the last 6 years or so, thinking about all of the education that the fear-free movement has put out for pet parents, for the veterinary communities, there's such a visibility right now of fear and anxiety issues, which is amazing. And it gives us an incredible opportunity now to advocate for these patterns, for these problems that owners and pet parents are now seeing, recognizing, and wanting to address. So amazing. And what are we reaching for, right? Is it, did we pick something because it was available through Amazon Prime and I could have it tomorrow? Was it something that, I would ask my vet, but dang, they're booked out months at a time. I could never get their opinion, so I'm not even going to bother. And then the veterinarian is even sort of oblivious that this decision-making process is even happening, right? There's so many different ways that consumers make their decisions, and even the value of the feedback that they get, whether it's coming from the veterinarian, from the client care representative sort of as a side comment, whether it's a Google review, whether it's, Susie in the grocery store who happened you bump into in the pet aisle, like who is it coming from and what is the actual value and I'd argue almost scientific validity of their opinion. Opinions are all valid and they don't all carry the same weight or strength based on the knowledge or the education that may come behind them. Again, not saying any opinions are invalid, but there is a stratification here based on the knowledge on which those opinions are founded.
Right. So in talking about ownership, say in your practice, you have an owner come in that wants to be a part of that wants to help and is very proactive in looking through some of these things, and they feel the need to be a part of that process. What are some things that you would suggest for pet parents or vets that are in the same position where they want to be a part of that process to look for or to potentially filter out as they're doing their own research to be a part of that process to bring back to their vet to say, hey, here's what I found. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the first point for me is to try to move just even a little bit beyond the label. Like, great, you're looking at the label and it's saying this is amazing for fear and anxiety. Go that little bit farther to say, number one, what's in it? Are we talking about a product that is, I remember looking at a label, this was a while back, and it's something what was like, may contain, da-da-da-da. I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean it may contain this? No, I want to know exactly what's in this. So are we talking about L-theanine? Are we talking about tryptophan? Are we talking about thiamine? Are we talking about, a colostrum calming complex? What is it that's within that? And either for that particular product or for that active ingredient, again, assuming that we can say with confidence that is in fact in there, what sort of research do we have to document, does that work? And if so, for what? And at what doses? And this is something that I've really been paying attention to. I was having a conversation with a practitioner just this last week, and he was like, hey, I was looking at these two products. How would you compare them? They look the same to me. And this particular practitioner had run down the list, and they both contained very similar ingredients. And yet we went one step farther, and the concentrations of those individual ingredients were dramatically different. And it doesn't mean that one of those products is inherently better or worse. But again, if we're looking at something that, let's say, has a combination of magnolia and philodendron, oh gosh, I know that there was a project that was done about 8-9 years ago that looked at that particular combination for noise sensitivity. Cool. If that's the patient that I have in front of me and that's our primary concern, awesome, then I'm probably going to skew in the direction of a product that has more of that particular ingredient and perhaps less than others, versus if I'm looking for perhaps an indirect way to really target the serotonin system, then I might be skewing more in a tryptophan direction, and I might leverage my recommendation there. So the first point here is sort of moving just a little bit beyond the label claim and saying, yes, it's labeled for fear and anxiety. What is in it? And is there any validity to the science that has really supported that particular product or those active ingredients?
Right. And I think you bring up a good point too about knowing what is science and what is not. So have clinical studies been done, not just those Amazon reviews of yes, this is great or no, it's not, but helping people understand what is evidence to whether this is something that could be a good idea to try with your dog or cat or not, based on where you're finding that information. And with dosages, it's so interesting. I find that to be a huge problem with CBD supplements.
Yes.
You'll notice there's this wide range of these recommended dosages and concentrations of CBD for various ailments. But even if you look at two different products that are addressing the same issue, essentially, say you take two that are meant for, fear-related aggression or anxiety, whichever, and they will have completely different concentrations, and you have no idea what strain it is necessarily, if the terpenes in it are even, specifically for that purpose as well, or if it's just for flavoring or scent or anything else. So yeah, I find that that's one of those industries, one of those supplements that is really difficult to navigate for just about anyone. And I've spoken with a lot of veterinarians that feel the same way. They're like, I don't even touch CBD because I have no idea. The recommendations are all over the place.
It is the Wild West as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's every man or woman for themselves, right? In terms of, what product are you pushing? What are you trying? And the frustrating part for me, when we look at sort of the expert opinion here, let's say of the veterinarian or the veterinary behaviorist, and when a client asks me, does CBD work? I kind of sort of pause, and I may even sound a little hesitant to answer because I'm like, I don't have a clue. Because, we put all of this into, let's call it the CBD bucket, right? And as you said, based on formulation, based on strength, based on purity, based on consistency, based on even consistency of dosing of the owner, did they know what to look for? I get this scatter plot of data, and I would like to say that it works and that I know what dose, which particular formulation, and what dosing frequency and all of that, but I don't have that yet. I know that there are some ongoing research projects, true placebo-controlled, blinded projects looking both at pain as well as neurologic function, as well as fear and anxiety, and so I'm hopeful that we're going to have more information. But I really struggle sometimes, and this, at risk of sort of skewing the conversation in a different direction prematurely, I want to really call out that idea that, gosh, if we're not sure that it's going to work, I'm not saying to go in completely skeptical and saying, I'm not going to try anything because I'm not confident, but it also frustrates me when I do work with a client who has, in some cases, spent thousands of dollars trying product after product after product after product, without knowing what they're looking for and just hoping. And then by the time we get to whether it's someone like myself or one of my colleagues or a credentialed trainer or behavior consultant, and they're saying, gosh, I'm out of money, I'm out of resources, and I'm out of hope. And I'm like, oh my God, like 18 months ago, we had such a full arsenal of tools at our disposal, and we don't have them anymore. So there is sort of this sort of double-edged sort of situation here where, yes, I want people to try. I want them to see if it's working, and, oh gosh, work with someone who can really help guide that process and help you to decide whether or not what you're doing is in fact making a measurable difference. Because if it's not, we need to move on. Let's try something different. Whether that's a different supplement, whether it's a different training approach, whether it's a medication, or maybe there's an underlying medical issue that's impacting the way in which that supplement is or is not affecting the behavioral profile of your animal. So many details are so important here.
Yeah, and especially I think too, expressing the expectations. So I find just in some of the clients that I work with that are trying different medications or different supplements, whether it's, backed by a veterinarian or not, they're doing these things and they're going through these experimentations, but understanding what the actual expectations are. I always tell people journal day to day. I was like, some of these differences are going to be really, really subtle, and you want to be able to pull them out over a timeline to determine whether it's something that's accurately working or is helping the problem versus hurting the problem, or just a plateau, basically.
Yes.
But I think too, I think people still expect supplementation to have the same effect as like behavior medication would, or a psychopharmaceutical, to where these medications are really strong typically, right? And they are going to produce a different outcome versus supplements tend to be, which I think is why people find them, safer, or they're more likely to use them. They're not as dramatic with their effects. And do you find that that's because they're meant to be in addition to, not just behavior modification, that's obvious, but in addition to using a psychopharmaceutical? Is it something that's meant to kind of pair, or do you feel that some of these supplements might actually be enough to help them with behavior modification and get them where they need to be in that process?
That's a great question, Sarah. And, and I will say that it's sort of all over the map. As we might expect, right? Like every animal is their own sort of behavioral study of one. Right. Mm-hmm. So, it's difficult to make sweeping claims in either direction. With that being said, where I often start this conversation with my clients or the veterinarians that I'm working with is, on one hand to say any of these supplements or psychopharmaceuticals can make a difference. So all of them work some of the time. Some of them work all of the time. No, not really. Right. Like nothing is ever going to be the panacea that we want it to be. And so having a mindset of going, well, we can try certain things. I'm going to make my recommendations about sort of where we go based on a couple of factors, with the first caveat that I'm going to call everything here for just a second medication, whether it's a supplement, whether it's a pheromone, whether it's a truly pharmaceutical, something that we're giving the animal in hopes that it has an impact for our purposes here, typically on fear, anxiety, stress, arousal, something along those lines. And when I look at all of the available options here under this medication or supplement category, what I have to remind myself and my clients is that none of those things that we're doing directly target learning, meaning they don't teach the animal anything, right? We may be able to sort of mitigate the impact of fear and anxiety. We may be able to reduce arousal and create a greater sense of well-being and calm, and using some of the buzzwords that are out there in the industry, right? We can do all of that. And much of what the animal is doing currently here right now is based on prior learning and understanding the relationship between antecedents, behaviors, and consequences based on the outcomes that animal has perceived. And so, back to your point about needing to combine whatever it is that we're using with some form of management and behavior modification, that's why. It's not like we're saying, oh, you'll get better results. It's like, no. You may not get any results. That with these supplements versus medication, and I'll come back to the stratification of strength here in just a second, that if the goal here is to reduce the impact of fear, anxiety, stress, emotional arousal on the animal's ability to learn, to be behaviorally flexible and adapt to new changing conditions, we might create that flexibility with a medication or a supplement, but unless we're also educating that animal, we're not going to see it, right? It's such an important thing to remember. And so yes, and then the magnitude of the effect we might be able to stratify between supplements and medications, knowing that I've had patients in my practice where we've trialed multiple medications because we felt that was the way to go. And when we didn't get the results that we were looking for, we said, well, we kind of skipped over supplements. Why don't we try, a combination there to see what works? And lo and behold, we find something that does. And of course, vice versa, where we've got maybe perhaps have a client and an animal where multiple supplements have been trialed without success. And, straight out the gate, we had, a home run with the first pharmaceutical that we reached for, because the magnitude of the effect is so much more profound. We can see it, we can work with it, we can modify it, and so on. So it's difficult to really say across the board where I would start. But I think it's important to recognize that continuum in each of those areas.
Yeah, that's completely understandable. I definitely can get where you're coming from there. But in regard to ingredients as well, in regard to specific supplementation, there's ongoing research that are trying all of these different factors. You mentioned like valerian and tryptophan and L-theanine and magnesium, and even in the mushroom spectrum like ashwagandha and lion's mane. As far as you know so far, are there any of these things that you've looked into as of now that you would say, I've seen absolutely nothing with this. I think this is just kind of crap. Or, yeah, I have seen some success with this in particular. I've seen it multiple times now, just in your own experience or your own practice, not necessarily what's out there literature-wise, but any ingredients in particular that you would say, yep, I'd be more inclined to look at these, and these over here, I'm probably not even going to mess with.
Yeah, here's one of the tricky things about the industry right now is that it's rare, in my experience, to find products that are purely one ingredient versus another. So you mentioned something like ashwagandha or lion's mane, just as an example, or we go into the sort of the adaptogen type spectrum, or we're going down we'll get to probiotics and prebiotics and all of that as well. But there's so many products out there that kind of take the kitchen sink approach. And I'm not saying that's a wrong thing to do, because in many cases we understand that a lot of these products, they may not be profoundly impactful on their own. And so we're using them in combination to really get that cumulative effect. That may be helpful, and also makes it really difficult as a prescriber to say, unless that particular ingredient in that formulation has been studied for that exact condition, it makes it really difficult to start leaning in to go, ooh, I think we're onto something here. And even when we start looking, overall, extrapolating what might work in a human, for example, if that's where the body of research is, doesn't automatically mean that, number one, that it's going to work the same way for a dog or a cat or a horse or any other animal. And it also doesn't mean that it's safe for those other species, knowing that there are very specific metabolism and metabolic pathway differences, even if we're just talking dogs versus cats. There are certain medications and certain supplements that, could be incredibly toxic to a dog, for example, thinking, just the first example that pops into mind, a little bit different from supplements, but looking at sugar alternatives like xylitol, for example.
Yes.
So common within chewing gums and within so many other products in the market, and even in extremely small concentrations can be lethal for dogs. So, again, we can't automatically assume, well, it was really helpful in people, and so therefore, maybe. Right. But unless we get that information to establish safety and efficacy in the species we're talking about, I was going to be a little bit, hopefully not skeptical or guarded, but certainly cautious and curious about whether this is something that may be of merit for a particular animal.
Well, that was the grain-free craze. Look what happened with that. All of a sudden people were saying, oh, I've got to cut grain out of my diet. Let's make all these dog foods without grain in them as well. And then we had this onset of problems that resulted afterwards from that. So you're correct. People think, oh, this is good for me. It must be good for my dog as well. I can eat chamomile. I'm just going to feed my dog chamomile also. And interestingly enough, too, you have that balance. Like, I always think everything in moderation. Is it okay to give my dog a pepperoni instead of a piece of lean meat? Sure, everything in moderation, right? You can eat McDonald's every once in a while on a road trip, but if you eat it every day, we're going to have a problem. And so I think about that balance too, to where, because these products aren't as regulated when people are trying them on their own, you have things even like salmon oil. And I don't know much about that balance in particular, but apparently there is one between inflammation, where a certain amount of salmon oil with a dog can reduce inflammation. A certain amount of salmon oil can increase the inflammatory response. So, bringing these factors into consideration, especially with client education, to help them understand it's not as simple as it may seem. It's not as simple as just trial and error. You may be doing more harm than good based on what the ingredient is. And like you had mentioned before, that specific dosage with that ingredient.
Yes, it all matters. Now, I'm flashing back when we talk about concentrations and even sort of drawing kind of black-white contrast between, let's say, supplement and pharmaceuticals, which, again, we know that there's a lot of gray and there's a lot of continuum within those spectrums. And yet, for this particular comment, I remember I was attending a psychopharmacology lecture. Gosh, this was before I was board certified, so this is probably back in the 06, 07, somewhere in that range. And it was a clinical pharmacist and pharmacologist, excuse me, who was answering a question. He said, here's the deal. There's often the perception that because it's a supplement, because it's natural, because it's whatever word we want to put on that, it's therefore better safer, easier to metabolize. He's like, when you actually look at many of these compounds and look at some of the purified versions, and again, I'm painting in very broad brushstrokes here. There's going to be exceptions to what I'm saying here as well as there being consistencies. But when we look at some of the pharmaceuticals, that in many cases we've taken an active compound that may be found within a natural, holistic, whole item, purified it, and created a way for the body to, in some cases, metabolize or utilize that ingredient more effectively in a more targeted way that actually may end up creating a safer usage of that ingredient compared to where it was in that whole compound. So again, the reason I bring this up here is not to automatically assume that pharmaceuticals are better, but also not assuming that because a supplement comes from a natural product that it's therefore safer or is going to really tie into that, again, kind of holistic approach to nutrition and wellness. Trust me, I've got no problems with that, right? I do a lot of that in my own world. And also, it's that, is this one of those times where we need to understand that there may be a more targeted, more effective way to go about this? Maybe yes, maybe no.
Yeah. And I think for the average person or even the average veterinarian that's trying to help somebody weed through some of all of this stuff, it's very difficult to know what your red flags are. So for other fields or areas, products that have been around for a very long time. Dog food is an example. There are preservatives that are going to throw up red flags. There's ingredients that are immediately going to throw up red flags. So even if you don't know about some of the things that that are in that and whether it's the right fit or the right match, at least you have a history to say, but I can point out these things and I really don't like that. Here's why I think this is unsafe. So let's choose something different. But I feel like with supplements now, because this is such a newer up and coming area that people are so very interested in, it's harder. Like, what are those red flags? And how do you kind of develop that same filtering system to where even if you don't necessarily know everything about all the ingredients that are listed in the supplements, you can still kind of filter that ahead of time and say, this is a red flag for me. That's a red flag for me. Is there anything in particular that you look for in supplements that you might consider, or someone brings to your attention that you'd say, I'm not so sure because this ingredient is in here?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think there's two things that come to mind for me there. Number one, even for someone like myself who, like, this is what I do, right? Like, this is my sole focus. Well, it's not my sole focus right now, but it's my primary focus, that I'm working with animals and working within that behavioral space. And even within that, people may present a product and I look at it and go, I actually don't know what 4 of these ingredients are. Like, I literally have no idea. Someone somewhere decided it was worth including. I don't know why. I don't have any ability to understand because I don't know. I can't find either, it's a proprietary blend of something, that's internally regulated, internally meaning within the company, or there's something else going on there that I'm just like, I don't actually know. The other thing that I think is a really important detail too is that for me, yes, I'm coming at it from the perspective of behavior. And so I'm really focused sort of on the efficacy and safety of those ingredients. But someone who comes at this, even still within the veterinary space, who comes at this as a gastroenterologist, for example, or someone who's a neurologist, they may have a completely different list of indications or contraindications based on their understanding of how those particular products might manifest in patients with different medical or health status. So it's difficult. So I say all of that to be able to come back to, if you're asking someone their opinion, whether that's, again, Susie in the store, whether that is, someone on the internet, whether it's your veterinarian, whoever it happens to be, I personally think that it's fair to ask a follow-up question. Hey, what do you think about this product? And what's your level of confidence in that recommendation? Meaning, is this really just an opinion, or is it founded on some degree of scientifically validated information? And I find that most people are pretty straightforward about that. And you're either going to get a sense where it's like, well, I've seen it work before. Cool. We're talking anecdotal.
Right.
Awesome. Not saying that's irrelevant, but as you pointed out earlier, Sarah, that's not a validated study. That's not looking at that product with 432 participants in a placebo-controlled blinded study. And I get a lot of consumers don't actually even know necessarily what those terms mean. And gosh, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, this was a couple of years ago, and we were talking about supplements for people. So again, slightly different topic here. And I said, well, gosh, Lisa, we've got this entire sort of list of here are the 7 studies that tell us. And she was like, yeah, I actually prefer to look at the testimonials because that is someone's real experience. I feel like the studies are manipulative to try to sell me on something. And I was like, whoa, oh no. but that was her reality, right? For her, It only seemed real if it was a testimonial. So we have individuals who are actually placing more weight on the lowest level of scientific information and feel manipulated or duped or somehow, skewed when they're looking at it as a study. So if what I just said sort of speaks to you, I would encourage you as a listener to say, hey, can I do a little bit of a deep dive, not necessarily on supplements versus pharmaceuticals, but on the process of how to evaluate scientific information? That to me is that's in and of itself. And there's resources out there that'll allow you to look at papers and understand what's of merit and what's not. That information exists. And it's so important to be able to look at this marketplace and then create some opinions for yourself that are not only founded on anecdotes and individual experiences and N of one sorts of examples, but truly reviewing the scientific literature even at a superficial level to say, hey, is this valid or not?
Yeah, it is. It's incredibly interesting, but you have to think like you and I are thinking about this, and so are veterinarians, from a scientific perspective, where that's not the field that everyone is in. It's not the field that the majority of people are in. They aren't thinking at it from that perspective. So of course I'm going to trust my neighbor Susie. I've known her for 20 years. Of course she's going to tell me the truth. And the pharmaceutical companies are the ones that are leading these scientific studies, and I can't trust that, but I can trust Susie next door, right? So often we have to step out of our scientific box and go, not everyone thinks like we do. Not everyone understands what's behind literature and research and these studies and controls. What is a control and how that dramatically affects the potential results or the potential outcome based on how you're deciding what to use or what not to use or what to even explore. Yes. So such a good point, because people they are more likely to put their faith and effort into something that could have some pretty tragic results, honestly, because of where it's coming from. Yeah.
And it's frustrating to me as a scientist where, let's talk about Susie next door for just a second, right? That is, Susie had an experience with a product. It worked in her estimation. And so she is 100% convinced that is a black-white decision. This works. And Susie is leaning into that with an emphatic level of emotionality.
Right.
And then that client comes to me and says, well, my next door Susie is really, really jazzed about this. And I go, well, I'm not 100% sure. Right? Like, it could be this, it could be that. Like, I'd have to know more about Susie and her dog. And now I look wishy-washy. Mm-hmm. I can't make up my mind about whether this is a good thing or not. And people are like, well, I'm going to trust Susie. She's so confident about what's going on. I'm like, okay. Right. It's so much easier to be confident about something when you're operating from a narrower field of knowledge versus when you recognize all of those variables. If you're not considering some of those nuances, you're actually going to miss a whole part of the picture. And that's potentially, as you just said, problematic, potentially even dangerous. So I want to be clear on that too. I get it. I understand why having a real solid opinion feels more trustworthy. It kind of does to me too, until I kind of have the ability to go, okay, pause, take a step back.
Let's be
pragmatic.
What
does this actually mean? Let's take a look at this.
Yeah, and I see it online all the time. I wish I could drop every Facebook forum I'm on, but you can't, right? We're in the industry. We gotta do it. But so often, people are asking about supplements, medications, medical advice to a community that is not even the least bit medical. It's the mom's club of, wherever it is. And you're like, oh my God, stop.
Stop. Yeah, it's train wreck. Can't look away, can't look in. And also diving in, as you said, not necessarily the most effective forum to be able to introduce scientific rigor and the ability to really evaluate, fact from fiction or fact from opinion even.
Well, and if you think about it too, there's only so much you can break down in terms of layman term for people who are not a part of the scientific community. It's like a car mechanic trying to explain to me how a particular engine works, one versus the other. I'm intelligent enough to kind of keep up with the conversation, but I don't know the names of any of these parts. And if you just whiz through them, I'm like, nope, you lost me. I can't follow that. So sometimes I feel it's just difficult, even just in breaking it down into terms, especially for veterinarians that are trying to explain things to clients as to why I want you to consider this. It may or may not work. And here's why I'm, as you would say, sounding wishy-washy, because these are all the factors that contribute to that, but being able to express it in a way that isn't from their scientific perspective. It's from the typical pet parent that is, in a completely different field. It's an attorney, or, it's a delivery man, or whatever the case may be, so that they can have a better picture as to why it might be advantageous to involve somebody with a scientific background or understand that. And, this brings me back to something that you said about looking at the dog as a whole, to where, yes, you might be addressing one problem, but you might be making another problem worse. I came across this the other day because, again, people send me stuff all the time to look at. I was looking at dental chews, right? Dental month is coming up. Everybody wants to know about dental chews and everything else. And I'm like, just brush your dog's teeth. But anyway, they don't want to. So I'm looking at dental chews, and I came across one particular product that had some pretty concerning ingredients. And I was like, the VOHC put their seal of approval on this package. And I'm thinking, how is that even possible? And then I start questioning myself. I'm like, are these okay now? Have we done more research and found out that they're not toxic ingredients? And, you're talking about giving one of these every single day. That's not in moderation anymore. This is continuous exposure to these products. And then I had to step back and go, because the Veterinary Oral Health Council, I'm sorry, that was not Freudian. Veterinary Oral Health Council is concerned about the mouth and the oral health of the animal. They're not considering necessarily the digestive process. Maybe they are, I don't know. Or the specific ingredients that are going to affect another organ system in the body in a different way. So for people, everyday average people who are trying to weed through some of these things to determine if it's a good fit, might actually be using an ingredient, a product, a supplement that could potentially help with, say, thunderstorm phobia, right? Or separation anxiety. But we might be hurting them in the process by whatever other additives could potentially be in those things.
Yes. Yeah. Holistic approaches, I think, are so important. And whether someone is using the word holistic to imply more sort of natural, alternative, complementary type therapies, or the way I tend to think about it, holistic meaning, WHOLISTIC, right? Holistic,
yes.
Looking at the entire animal and trying to get as best we can a picture of what the ripple effect might be here. And it's amazing how some of those things just we don't even think about, right? And an example in my own household over the last month or so, my own dog had an acute back spasm episode. It's pretty bad, truthfully, mid-December, that landed us in the ER. He since had a CT. It was bad enough to warrant a lot of things. Anyways, we put him on pain control. He immediately felt better. He put him on cage rest, crate rest, huge crate, huge. It's like half the size of a room. Anyways, to be able to limit his activity in that acute phase to prevent additional injury. And even as a veterinarian, we did all of those things, and I'm confident that that was the right thing to do. And then about 2 weeks goes by, and I look down, and I was like, oh, dude, you've gained 4 pounds. He's a 50-pound dog, right? He put on almost 10% of his body weight because of reduced activity, because of a little bit of sedation from the pain medication. So even when he wasn't active, he really was just laying there being very passive, which was helpful for healing. Mm-hmm. And I didn't compensate in another way by saying, hey, you actually don't need as much food right now in this short term. I promise, buddy, you're not going to starve. But again, different example, moving away from supplements for a second, but just a real, visible way of recognizing, wow, I did something that was 100% recommended and the right thing to do. and there was a ripple effect that I didn't anticipate. And that's visible, not to mention all of the things that may be invisible because of what's happening internally within the animal. So, when we get this sort of, this whole conversation around supplements and multi-ingredient supplements and this versus that and concentrations, those are some of the things, some of the reasons why we get so concerned, aware, conscientious.
Take pause, before giving too much advice in one direction or another, because you're right. You have to look at the dog as a whole and see what's going on to determine whether that's going to work or not. And I think too, pointing it out to owners to be aware, if you see any digestive changes or, any mood differences or eating habits, if your dog all of a sudden becomes anorexic or, is voracious, wants to voraciously eat their food, just little things like that to determine if any tweaks need to be made. Yeah, kind of like in the example that you're giving as well, certainly.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, too, the benefit of journaling and jotting down some of those observations. And when I'm counseling clients and pet owners through that, the thing that I'm typically recommending is jot down anything that either seems stuck, meaning you were sort of hoping this was going to get better, but it's not, or anything that seems different, even if it seems unrelated to the reason why we were using that. It's the whole picture that's going to give us a sense of, is this doing what we wanted it to do, number one, and is there any sort of, collateral damage or any other problems that are shifting in other unexpected or unanticipated directions. And rather than just journaling, the frequency of barking in response to separation from owner, for example, if we're working with a separation-related problem, that's great to keep tabs on. That's going to give us perhaps a measure of efficacy, but it's not going to give us the full picture. And if I'm looking for the full pattern of how this supplement or pharmaceutical is impacting the overall health and behavioral well-being of that animal, I really do want the holistic picture. So journal, stuck, and moving as best you can.
What are those differences? And then I'm going to add on top of that, because one of the more difficult things that I run into when I reach out to a veterinarian for information about behavior in the clinic or in practice, or what they've seen, or if they can see any timeline of history, any succinct changes in the animal, there are no behavior notes. And I'm pushing and pushing, make behavior notes. Every time that animal comes in, make a behavior note, even if it's just short, succinct, quick, seems slightly timid or cautious, or gave a little growl or a lip curl, or anything objective that you can throw in there that will help. And so I want to throw some exclamation points around when a client brings that information and has actually done the work that you asked them to do, because that's hard too, compliance. Woo! But to translate that into their file, into their record, so that you can utilize that information, because it is impossible to hold all of that in your head and think that, oh yeah, that client will trigger a memory. And then you're like, but is that this dog or was that the other dog? Right. So I highly encourage, and I just wanted to take a moment to say, if your client does that and they've done their due diligence and they're being compliant, take those notes and put those into your system so that you have those and you can reflect on those as things are progressing or plateauing, or whatever the case may be. You at least have that baseline. We do baselines with lab work. We do baselines with temperature, even though we're kind of getting out of that now, but we do baselines with everything else that you're triaging when your clients come in. So do your behavior triages too, so you know which direction to hopefully go in or try or see what you've done prior.
100%. No, and you bring up such a great point too, in that what seems so salient in that moment. Oh, I'm going to remember this. This was so dramatic. Yeah. This was so important. No, I actually don't know if this client's going to call me again tomorrow and sort of jog that memory again with, so I get that update and I get that memory reconsolidation, or that client goes home today and then their life takes a left turn and I don't hear from them for 6 months, and then they call me back up asking to follow up on that conversation, and I've got nothing in my record. I have no recollection of it. Did I talk to you? Was I don't remember. So yeah, jotting it down. And this is tricky too, right? As you know, working in the clinic situation, documentation takes time. So is there a system that allows for us to do that, whether it's voice dictation, whether it's leveraging staff members, whether it's using some of the scoring systems like the FAS, or the Fear, Anxiety, Stress score from the Fear Free organization? Yes. Make it doable, right? Versus saying, oh, I've got to capture every single note. I need a transcript of my conversation. No, nobody's saying that. Just get something down that you can reference back and answer that question. Hey, with now what we're seeing, do we think that's better, worse, or no different?
Yeah, I think that'd be really helpful. So, speaking of products and ingredients, I did throw some at you because I'm curious. There are a number of supplements that I find are very popular. Lots of Amazon reviews, lots of things going on, lots of people using them. So I wanted to just give some specific examples and see what your thoughts are. Just have you go through them and say, yes, I like this. No, I don't. I would never use this because, or sure, in, cases XYZ, I might think about pairing it, or I might think trying on its own. Now, I know a lot of that is very subjective based on the individual animal that is currently in front of you. So some of this is very generalized, right? Yeah. But because some of these things are so popular, I thought maybe we could pick apart a couple of different products that are out there on the market just to give people a direction to think about, just some things to ponder when you're looking at specific labels to say, these are the things I would look more into, or I feel comfortable with this, but obviously there's always the caveat is it for the right thing for the dog that's in front of me?
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And of the ones that you listed that you sent through ahead of time to take a glance at, it was curious to me that, almost all of the ones that were on this list were actually new data points for me. I was like, I've never even heard of most of these products.
Oh, interesting.
It was interesting. So like what the reason I really, that in and of itself struck me was that popularity from a purchasing, marketing, review standpoint doesn't actually correlate to awareness or validity of product or any of those things. And so it was interesting. So, I took a little bit of a deep dive in a couple of them. And, what I find, again, kind of coming back to something we were talking about before, that the way in which I approach them is less related to popularity or number of reviews and more about what's in it. And, at least the ingredients that I have had in my clinical practice, again, as a behaviorist working with cases where we are, specifically targeting fear, anxiety, stress, behavior patterns fueled by big feelings and emotion in most cases, not all, but in most, I tend to lean on products that have more of again, where the research is, right? L-theanine, we've got a ton of research on tryptophan, alpha-casozepine, some of the new calming care probiotic type options as well. We've got research to give us an indication of when is this likely to be helpful, when is it not. And so I tend to skew in those directions. When I look at a lot of the other products, and I'm kind of lumping together some of the ones that we were chatting about earlier, is that again, it becomes such a multimodal approach. There's so many ingredients on the label that it really makes it difficult for me to weigh in a really solid, I totally give that, versus I'm not quite so sure. I'm looking at it, number one, from ingredients. I'm also looking at brand reputation. Mm-hmm. And for me, many of the products that are out there are companies that I know nothing about. I don't necessarily know about their formulation standards. I don't know if they're actually looking at batch consistency from one production group to the next. I'm not aware of whether they're actually doing aftermarket testing to confirm ingredients. I don't know any of those things about so many of the products that are out there and many of the companies. And I find it really difficult to chase down each of those things because, and this is just my own personal experience here, is that I've done this with a lot of products and I get almost sort of, it's difficult to sort of tease out the forest from the trees, where I get to the end of a long, deep dive and I've got this graphic on my desk where I'm like, okay, well, this is this, I'm at this concentration in this species, and I've got this huge sort of flow chart, and I'm like, I don't know that I'm any closer to an answer on this as to whether I would recommend this or not. So let me go back to my core and say, what's in it? Purity standards, reputation, and all of those sorts of things. So it's a really long-winded answer to a question. I know it's probably more general and probably even a little bit vague, but dang, it's where I land every single time, unless it's a product that I know and have used and trust the manufacturing and distribution process. And I just mentioned the word distribution. I also want to mention that too, that especially when we're doing a lot of online shopping, the number of places and times where I've heard from clients who have purchased from certain retailers and end up with a redirected product that did not go through the appropriate recommended distribution channels, and they're actually getting sort of a repackaged or expired product. Again, I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it happens often enough in my direct view that it makes me really concerned about some of the ways in which products are handled and whether we're actually getting what we paid for as consumers.
Yeah, that makes sense. And don't worry, I'm not going to push you into giving specific details about things. I like that you're landing on this from a general platform, because there really aren't ways to fine tune it without having the research on these things. And you're right. I feel like a lot of the products, and the ones that I sent you too, they are throwing the kitchen sink at it. They're like, well, we hear that this helps and this helps and this helps, so something's bound to help this animal. Let's put all those things into one product. That way it'll work no matter what. And people are going to love it. And that's what we're going to go off of, not this particular ingredient is helpful in this situation. This particular ingredient is helpful in this situation. And you mentioned calming care. And that was one of the things that I like about Purina. So they have their probiotic supplements. They have calming care for behavior. And then we've got Fortiflora for GI, intestinal issues and things like that. But you'll notice with a company like Purina, where I have lots of disagreements on a lot of the products they make. And that's a whole nother side story. But when it comes to their probiotics, they have narrowed it down to the specific strain that is well-researched. There's lots of literature out there. With your calming care, you got your Bifidobacteria longum, and, that is specific to anxiety. They've tested it on anxiety. And with your Fortiflora, they're looking at one specific strain. So in looking at some of the calming supplements that I went through, you'll notice there are multiple strains of different things that are in them, because they might have an effect versus, yes, we know this has an effect. And I found that a lot with the GI supplements too. That was something I found quite in common with calming supplements or behavior supplements in particular. And the other thing I was going to ask you about too, that I don't think people really realize is product sourcing. This is huge in the food industry as well from a nutrition perspective, but a lot of ingredients, on the labels, you'll look at some of these calming supplements and these chews for separation related problems or fear or anxiety or stress. And it'll say packaged in the US or globally sourced. And you're like, what does that mean? Are you ordering your ingredients from China one week and then the next week you're ordering them from Mexico? And who's making sure that these manufacturing companies or these production plants are actually not cross-contaminating with other things that could potentially be harmful? So when you mention knowing brands and trusting brands, I think that's one of those big glaring answers as to why. I mean, there's probably some very wonderful up-and-coming new brands that just don't have enough time behind them to show how wonderful they are. But at the same time, it's risky.
Yes.
Because if you're looking at products that are produced from, one of these newer brands, you don't know where things are being sourced, especially when it says globally sourced. Well, that's anywhere in the world. And that can change at any given point in time based on the batch or what the product is costing.
Yeah. And it's such a great point, Sarah. And I think that there's a danger here, and I'm hearing sort of even some of the thoughts that are going through my own head, where if I were someone listening to yours and my conversation now, I might hear that we're like, oh, cool, so we're big supporters of big pharma then, right? So we're sort of going in all that direction. You've got to be able to do all of these things. And that's not universally true, at least not for me, and I suspect the same for you, right? I'm not automatically saying because someone has done all these things, therefore they're reputable. But there's a track record that exists, and sometimes the lack of information from a startup, from a smaller company, from a company that maybe only has one or two products that they're in development on, there's a lack of information there. So I don't mean to disparage a company that hasn't necessarily developed a track record yet, and I'm not saying that I'm endorsing something that has arbitrarily, but it's that critical thought process of saying, hey, who are you? What are you doing? How are you doing this? Where are your ingredients coming from? You mentioned the cross-contamination piece again, which I think is a brilliant point to note, especially with some of the lessons that we've learned, especially on the human side of nutrition and supplements, that there can be some significant sensitivities to individual ingredients unless we've got some sense of confidence that we're not getting cross-contamination, we really could be doing harm. And it's perhaps even more important in the animal industries where, our animals do not have the ability to go, you know what? That last batch of that medication, I don't know. Something felt a little funky in my upper GI on that one. Like, they don't have the ability to do that. And sometimes things have to reach such a gross level of awareness and observation before we can really see it or recognize it. So I just tend to be a little bit more cautious in all of the ways that you mentioned to really try to not do harm in the process of trying to do some really good stuff for our clients and our patients.
Right. Well, and so, okay, let me propose a scenario. So let's walk through like a real life scenario. You as the board certified veterinary behaviorist who might use supplements, might not, might pair them with psychopharmaceuticals, might not. You have this friend, right? Who is like, I've noticed that using these ingredients is really helpful for fear aggression. Okay. And so I want to try this out. I'm really convinced. I've done the research, I've got my formulation, and I need a vet behind this product because I want to know that, somebody that's in this profession knows that I've done the right thing by compiling these ingredients and putting together a product that's going to address this problem, whatever this problem might be. So what are your recommendations and suggestions? How do you go about taking something that is on a whim because it's worked for some person who has a big heart and wants to introduce the success that they've had with, that's how a lot of these companies start off, with all these other people that are going through the same, traumatic experiences with their own dogs. And so this person comes to you, you have a good rapport with them because you've known them for a long time, and you're like, okay, I see where you're going with this. No, we're not just going to start trying this out clinically. Here's what you need to do. Here's how to know whether this is going to be something that people are going to want to explore from a scientific approach and what that looks like.
Yeah, it's the first thought that comes to my mind is how much time do we have to get into all of these details, because it is complicated. But I'm going to try to sort of distill this down in a way that makes sense to me. So if the client is coming to me and says, yeah, this, and I'm going to use that probably a lot in this conversation, this, meaning whatever this product or collection of ingredients happens to be, this has helped my dog. Cool. What are your observations? For this dog or for the dogs or the cats or the animals that you've got data on so far, what was your baseline? What was done? And what were the results? And to tease each of those out, coming back to the original observations, what were the behavior patterns that were observed? With what frequency? What was the duration? What was the recovery? Do we have a solid enough picture of those individual animals to be able to lump that entire group of animals into a cluster and say, oh yeah, they're actually similar enough animals that I can kind of treat them as a group? Or it's diverse enough if I'm going in the direction of this could be helpful for everybody. But there are statistical methods to be able to determine that based on then saying, what did I do? So you're talking about a supplement, you're talking about this particular intervention. Is that the only thing that was done? Or even just in talking about treating for fear and anxiety, were there any other recommendations that were given to the client that could act as a confounder? Where, was this a placebo effect? Was it something where, the supplement did nothing, but because there's an observation bias, we now have folks either hoping or perhaps even making other changes within their day-to-day life that are actually making a big difference. And we know the power of environmental management and behavior modification. And even whether it's, intentional or perhaps even a bit unconscious or subconscious in terms of the implementation, that can be really, really profound in the way that the animal either behaves or the way in which their behaviors are observed. So that's all within sort of the what did we do piece. Are we confident enough that it was essentially the only thing that was being done? And do we have, we mentioned before, sort of more of a placebo control. Do we have a similar group of dogs that we gave something that sort of looked like, smelled like, and acted like the test supplement, but didn't contain those same active ingredients? And if the product you have is actually doing something, then we should find that your treated group gets better, in whatever way we're defining better, to a more significant degree compared to placebo. And we also, just as a little aside, we know that placebo-based trials, even when it's only a placebo-based trials, those often have significant impact on behavior
Yes.
and other observations too. So this
Yep.
piece, even in really evaluating, did what we gave, I think it was a terrible sentence, did what we gave in that case, did it make a difference, or was there something else that was a confounder? And then we're still looking at that next step of, and what was the result? Back to some of the same things that I mentioned with our baseline. What are we measuring? Is it a particular type of behavior? Is it a frequency? Is it a duration? Is it a recovery? Is it something about that animal? Or are we looking at physiologic data or biochemical data to really establish efficacy as well as safety, and not being able to detect any unwanted problems or patterns that may have emerged through the process of whatever this treatment happened to be, right? If we have all of that, that's essentially the basis of a scientifically validated experiment to determine whether we can actually come out of that and say, yeah, I've got a reasonable confidence that this thing actually works for the thing that you're describing it. Anything less than that is down in the sort of the lower levels of scientific validity. And I'm not saying we dismiss it, but it's not the same thing in terms of being able to lean into that. So that is my answer to that person who comes and says, I think I've got this thing that's magic. Well, let's test it. And that's what it looks like. What would you add to that, Sarah?
Well, I think I would add a question to that. So can you actually really determine the efficacy of said magic drug in this supplement if you don't look at it from not just the behavior perspective? Oh, this made my dog feel better. My dog has more pep in its step. It's not shivering in its crate. It's coming out more. Can you actually have an answer to that without the physiological side? So are we looking at cortisol levels? Well, we know now that measuring cortisol levels doesn't always provide adequate results because just physical activity increases cortisol. Good stress increases cortisol. So what are the physiological aspects? Are we looking at heart rate? Or is the animal in a condition or in an environment where you can adequately measure those things without, falsely, what's the word I'm looking for? Inducing something that isn't there,
Yes.
basically. So yeah, can you even determine that without looking at it from a physiological standpoint and an observational standpoint with, here are the behavior changes that I have or have not noted? Like, I feel like maybe you need both of those pieces combined to make, an adequate representation. And then I think testing this is tough because, you think about, why we're doing this. We're doing this to help an animal in need, right? So if you don't take that three-pronged approach that you talk about, where you do have the behavior modification piece and you do arrange their environment, and then we consider whether we're doing medications or supplementations, like if you're only looking at that supplement, are you really doing better for that animal? Or are you just kind of, let's try this and see what happens and roll the dice, and maybe the animal gets better, but maybe it gets worse because we're not doing everything that we need to do for it. So yeah, that would be my question. Like, can we even make a determination without those two factors? And is it right to make those determinations without that three-pronged approach?
Yes. I'm so glad you added that addition on there too, because I think it is important. And it's one of the reasons why, and I'll be honest, as a practitioner, as a prescriber, it's one of my kind of conflicts where I say exactly that. Oh, I can't stand behind this product, whatever it is, because they don't have the data. And yet getting the data is so incredibly challenging at the level that gives me confidence to make the recommendation, which brings me back to sounding wishy-washy, like I can't just make up my mind. Like, no, I'm very clear. I'm 100% unanimous in exactly how I feel about this. And the answer is it sort of depends. And we've got to be able to come back to that N of one. What is best for this animal? And how do we gather that information in a way that starts to give us more of that information? And again, I know that takes time, it takes money, it takes resources, it takes a lot of effort to get that, which brings me back to some of the companies, some of the ones that I work with routinely, companies like Nutramax or VetraScience or Siva or Vetaquinol, or some of those companies that do have the resources to put some of the testing into this to give us something that we can actually go, ooh, under these conditions, I have confidence that these products did these things.
Right.
That gives me confidence as a prescriber. It still doesn't guarantee that that particular intervention is going to work for this animal, but I at least have a solid foundation of where I'm coming from, and I know what to expect. I have confidence that it will be well tolerated, or if there is a side effect potential, I know what that's likely to be based on the thousands of reports, or hundreds of thousands in some cases, that have come in to really help us understand those details. So it's a really important stage of that entire process, and it really impacts the prescriber's ability to make those recommendations in a confident way.
Yeah. So out of curiosity, how frequently do you prescribe supplements and or pairing supplements with a psychopharmaceutical?
Yes, it's a good question, and I would say that when we look back at the cases that we manage within the animal behavior clinic, knowing that it's myself and I've got 3 other doctors who work with me in the practice here in Portland, when we look back at our cases, I would say that the majority of our patients do receive some form of recommendation under this third prong medication umbrella, which includes supplements, pheromones, probiotics, prebiotics, nutrition, as well as pharmaceuticals, right? So we're giving some sort of a recommendation there. Not because we think that every animal, quote unquote, needs that, but as we were talking about before, if we're moving forward with environmental management and behavior modification, if we can smooth that process, speed it up a bit, reduce without sedation or side effects, but reduce the impact of emotional interference with learning, can we get to a better place faster and more reliably, right? So the vast majority of our patients do get some sort of a recommendation there. As to pharmaceuticals versus supplements, it varies based on a couple of factors. Again, when we look at these cases, in some cases, it may be based on client preference. That, I may have a client who comes in and says, you know what, at least today, I'm really not interested in pharmaceuticals, but if there were something on the supplement side or the more natural products, I'd be open to considering that. Cool. Then that may be, regardless of my recommendation, that may be a place where we start to see whether or not that is in fact enough for this animal to achieve the progress that we're looking for. So sometimes it has almost nothing to do with the animal and is more sort of client or consumer driven in some cases. In some cases, there may be something else going on medically for that animal. Let's say it's an animal that has more of a GI sensitivity, for example, or is sensitive to certain ingredients from a skin or epidermal barrier standpoint. And so I may be saying, actually, there's this supplement that I think might actually be a better fit for your animal's unique needs, avoiding potentially, if there's a side effect profile that may be relevant within the medication, keeping in mind that particular determination could go in either direction. I may be recommending the pharmaceutical for exactly the same reasons based on that animal's medical status, which is why getting that medical status is so important. It may also be a matter of understanding certain patterns of diagnosis and certain patterns or even quote unquote labels for the behavior, meaning, we've got certain plant extracts, for example, that have been previously tested as a benefit for patients with noise sensitivity, for example. So I may look at that and go, okay, big picture holistic pattern, I could go in a lot of different directions. If I really wanted to hone in on this particular area, I may look for products, pharmaceutical or supplement that include this cluster of ingredients. So in some cases, it's the very specific pattern that the animal is presenting with that may give me more of an indication in one direction or another. And then I would say for many of our patients, you would ask as well, how often are we using them in combination? And I find where a lot of our patients are, we may start with a supplement as we're onboarding some of our management and behavior modification recommendations. Say, hey, I don't know if it's going to make a difference, but let's try, right? Let's try to smooth this process. Let's get us moving in the right direction. If we come back to our next recheck in a week, in a month, or however long is appropriate between those appointments, and if we're not making some headway, then we may layer in a pharmaceutical at that point in time. But if you tell me that your impression was that the supplement made a difference, we may actually keep that on board for a little bit. again, I don't want to take something away if it's making a difference. So then we'll look at the interaction between the supplement and the pharmaceutical to make sure that there's nothing concerning there, and then continue moving forward, knowing that at some point in the future, maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, maybe it's a year, we may drop out some of those initial products to say, hey, is it still making a difference? Or have we created enough progress through our behavior modification and our overall comprehensive treatment plan that it's no longer relevant anymore? And I'm going to make that same determination on the pharmaceutical side as I do on the supplement side. So I would say that we're often onboarding supplements and then layering in pharmaceuticals, but I do have clients who come into me, or patients who come into me who are already prescribed pharmaceuticals, and let's say they've achieved 60 or 70% of their goals, and we're just looking for that next 10, 20, 30%. I don't know that I necessarily want to throw another big drug at that animal. What if we worked more synergistically and added in a supplement at that point in time? Again, I don't have quite as big of an ask of that supplement to try to do all of the heavy lifting as I may have had on the front side of a plan. And so I may be adding it in on the tail end or midstream to treatment as well to try to facilitate what we're trying to accomplish. So it can look really different from one case to the next, but we do often use them in combination with one another for sure.
Yeah, I love that you brought that point up. It's by definition what even behavior modification without medication work looks like, to where we're going to try this. Let's see what direction it takes us. If it's working well, maybe the plan step 2 that we had already in our mind is what we were going to do next doesn't need to happen because this is on a good trajectory. Let's stick with it. Or, this isn't working out so well, but maybe it's opening the door for learning, and we still will onboard a medication per se, a behavior medication, but at least we have the opportunity to start our behavior modification plan, because now we can at least get this animal to a point where they're not so through the roof with anxiety or so through the roof with fear that we can actually begin some behavior modification work. And knowing that there are options to kind of get you through, because you think about some of these drugs that take 4 to 6 weeks to truly onboard. What do you do in the meantime? Just let the dog do what the dog normally does? No, because the owner is really frustrated. They're probably already at the end of their rope. They need some help. Yes. But again, that learning period, if they're just, such a severe case that there isn't any learning to be happening because they're so over threshold all the time and so stressed, that being able to have that option to layer something in and then look at how that layering has helped from a supplemental perspective as to whether that is inducing an environment that this animal now is able to learn. And maybe it's not a lot, but we're starting to see some progress. And then at the end of that kind of regimen, are we going to continue that because we like the progress that we're seeing? Or, yeah, we're going to still continue with the same plan we had before. Yes, we're going to continue to onboard a medication or do something differently, but at least there are so many options. And I think it's important to always kind of tease out that is behavior in a nutshell. Whether you're looking at it from a medical perspective, you're looking at it from straight behavior modification, like you have to be able to adapt and flow based on the dog that's in front of you and how they're either progressing, plateauing, or regressing in any sense. So I like that those options are available. I like that it isn't, okay, a mathematical equation, this is input, this is output. Like, it's never that simple, unfortunately.
No, it's not, and I think it's I'm glad we're getting to this part of the conversation here too, especially for folks who may be listening thinking, well, gosh, like, do we use supplements at all? I'm like, yes, we use them all the time, but I think the selection criteria is really important. I think having a really solid idea of what we think the supplement may do and on what timeline, as you just mentioned, is this something that I can, add on board right here, right now, thinking about some of the pheromone products, for example. Not that every animal is a huge responder to them, but some of them are. And when they work, it's almost an immediate effect. And so, that's great. If we're looking for some immediate benefit, even as a trial, great, let's try it. But if we've used it consistently for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and it's not making a difference, it's probably not going to. So if you're really considering, again, whether it's a pheromone, whether it's a supplement, whether it's a pharmaceutical, asking the prescriber, hey, how long does this typically take, and what's our game plan? If things are better, how long are we likely to use it? If it's not better, what's our next step? Or do we just wait for that? But what's the timeline that would allow us to make that determination? Because I don't want someone literally spinning their wheels and spending money for supplements that are coming in on auto ship because that's what we thought was going to be the best deal here. And here we are now 2 months, 6 months, 10 months down the line. And oh my gosh, that's potentially 10 months of learning that we can't undo for that animal. So I don't want to skip over the supplements by any stretch of the imagination, but I want to make sure that we're using them really strategically and not expecting the supplement to do the heavy lifting where environmental management and behavior modification need to be involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, always a catalyst, not ever the silver bullet, basically.
100%.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap it up because I know you have a hard stop at 90 minutes and I want to be very respectful of your time. And I could go on and on because I love the idea too of talking about the probiotic supplements that help the GI tract because the GI tract is related to the brain. And if you have but anyway, we won't get into that today. Perhaps I can pull you on for another one on that topic because that's one of my favorites too. And it has to do with supplements. But thanks so much for enlightening us as always. I always walk away from a conversation with you feeling good about my day because you're such an infectious, bright personality and you bring so much to the table. And I just want to say thanks for providing some information and being a good voice, a very reasonable voice for, and I know you call it generalizing answers, but it's not. You're really introducing a lot of reason. These are all the things that we need to think about. And I really appreciate you bringing that perspective to the table so people are using those magnificent brains and actually thinking through it. And it's okay if you seem a little wishy-washy. You kind of should be in this. There's a little element of goodness to that, to where you pause and you think, is it the right thing for the dogs that's in front of me? So thank you for being a highlight to that concept, because I think that's really important, especially when you're looking at something that is a field that isn't really all that well researched just yet. It's up and coming, and so we don't have all the answers. So thank you for that. Thank you for all of your input. And as always, your brilliant way of thinking to look at some of these difficult topics and dissect them.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I agree. We could keep this conversation going for hours, but I know listeners probably have other agendas too. So I agree. We'll put a pin in the rest of the topics. We'll come back to those another time. And again, as always, thank you. And for those listeners who may not have a full perspective on what it really takes to continue producing quality content and getting that out to everyone, it takes a ton of work on the back end. So a huge kudos to you, Sarah, and your team for really continuing to put in the work to make that happen. I fully support that. It's an honor of mine to be a guest on the show, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that.